Oh, wait a minute, I still have my coffee to finish. Another thing that I add in my simple project that is still missing in the current project is the cooldown for our spells, and also the limit of how many times we want to cast the spells per turn. And by simply adding those two limits in the game, it should add way more variation, because the player is not going to be able to always cast the same spell over and over and over, because it's going to be on cooldown. So let's get to it. And in Unreal, the first thing we need to create this mechanic is a way to remember which spell we just casted during our turn, and I'm going to save that in the unit data. So let's go in the core units in utilities and create ourselves a new structure. So blueprint structure, which I'm gonna name s_unit data underscore spell state, and let's open that one. And the first thing I'm gonna do is change the variable type to a mapping of eSpell, so eSpell enum right here, to an integer. So change to a mapping to an integer like that. I'm going to rename the variable spell cast count this turn, so how many times we casted the spell this turn. And I'm also going to create a second variable that I'm gonna name spells cooldown. So we have both variables. We need to keep track of all the spells we casted this turn and which spells are in cooldown. Let's save that structure, we can close it, and we're gonna go add it inside the s_unit data. So let's create a new variable, which I'm gonna name spell state, and it is going to be of type s_unit data spell state. Perfect. Now we can save and close this structure also, and we're done with the structure for the units. And now the next step is to go add the limits to our spells. So I'm gonna go in my spells, the utilities, and open the structure s spell data requirements. And I'm going to add myself two new variables of type integer. So the first variable right here, an integer, which I'm gonna name mass cast per turn. So how many times we can cast this spell per turn. And the second variable is also going to be of type integer, and I'm going to name it cooldown turn count. So how many turns we have to wait before being able to cast the spell again. Perfect, let's save and close this structure. Now we're just going to go in the DT spell data to modify our spells to use these two limits. And in my case, since I don't have that many spells, I have to be creative and it doesn't always make sense. But anyway, it's just for debug for now, so we can design the spells later on. But first, the first thing I did is to change the mass cast per turn to 999 for every spells. That way they don't have a limit of how many times we can cast them per turn. And if you are able to cast your spell 999 times in one turn, there's probably another issue somewhere. So anyway, that's what I did for all my spells, and then I just went through all my spells one by one and decide which one I wanted to add a limit. So first one is the sword slash. I wanted to add 1 turn cooldown every time we cast a spell, so the unit is going to have to wait until the next turn before casting it again. Then the sword throw is still the same, and then the short range arrow, I added a limit of 2 times per turn, so we can only cast it twice per turn. Long range arrow is normal. The dark wave has a 3 turns cooldown, so we can wait 3 turns before casting it again. The heal should not have any difference. The slime ball, only casting it once per turn. There's a limit on this one. And for the run chicken run, I added a 2 turns cooldown. For the wind gust, I didn't change anything. And that's it for the data table. Let's save and close it, and we're ready to go work on the code. And that's gonna be inside the BP unit, so let's go in there. Unit, open BP unit. But before we jump into the flow, we're gonna create a few utilities function that we're gonna use to be able to easily get and set the values of the cooldown and the maximum cast per turn, because it's pretty deep in the data structure. So here we have the unit data, inside it we have the s_unit data, and inside it we have to break to have access to how many times we cast the spell this turn and or the cooldown of the spell. So instead of doing all that every time we want to access that information, we're just going to have some utilities function. So let's start with the first one, get spell cast count this turn right here. So we feed it the spell we want to know, and then we receive the amount of time we casted the spell this turn as output. So here it is, I have my new function. I just made sure to make it pure just so it's easier to call later on. And then for the logic, it's super simple. We just have to get the unit data, break it to have access to the spell state that we are going to break again to have access to both mapping that are inside it. Then we can simply do a find on one of those mapping, which is the spell cast count this turn, because this is the get spell cast count this turn, so that makes sense. We are feeding it the spell we receive as input, and then we return the amount of time we casted the spell this turn. So yeah, that's a lot of nodes, so we don't want to do that every time we want to have that information. We're just going to call this new function instead, and we're going to do the exact same thing but for the spell cooldown. So let's duplicate this function right here. I'm going to rename it get spell cooldown. So get spell cooldown, here we go. And then I'm just going to use the second mapping instead of the first one when I'm doing my find right here. So now I'm finding the spell cooldown. I'm also going to rename the output variable to cooldown because it makes more sense. So great, now we have an easy way to have access to both those variables. That's good, but now we also need a way to easily set those two variables. So I'm just going to create myself a new function for that, because the variable is located inside a structure, so that's a bit annoying to modify. So let's do that inside its own function right here. So I have the new function set spell cast count this turn, so we're gonna be able to change the how many times we casted the spell per turn, and I'm feeding it two input. The first one is the spell we want to modify, and the second one is the cast count, which is the value we want to assign to the spell. And here, before setting the variable, we just want to make sure that the variable changed in between. We don't want to set the same variable that was already there. So right here, I'm just going to do a not equal to make sure that the cast count we receive as input is not the same as the current cast count. Here we go. Now we are sure that the variable changed and we want to assign it. So let's do it. I'm going to assign it in my mapping. So inside my spell cast count this turn mapping right here, I'm just going to do an add using my spell and the cast count we want to set to that spell. And once we're done with that, we just have to notify the rest of the game that the stats of the unit just changed by calling the callback call on unit stats changed right here. And now we're gonna do the same thing but for the cooldown. So let's create the set spell cooldown function right here. I'm feeding it the same input, so the spell and the cooldown, and then we're gonna do the exact same thing. So first we check if the variable is different, and if it is, we are going to set it inside the mapping. And once that's done, we're gonna call the callback like that. Here we go, same as the previous one. Just make sure that you replace the function right here at the beginning, so get spell cooldown instead of the cast count, and then use the mapping of the spell cooldown instead of the cast count. So awesome, we now have an easy way to set and get those values. We just need one last thing before we start using those functions, and it is a way to just reset those mappings, because let's say at the beginning of each turn we want to reset how many times we casted the spell during the previous turn, because we don't want to remember that. And same thing at the end of the combat, we don't want to remember all the cooldown and everything. So I'm just going to create some reset function, because I think it's going to be a little bit more clean. So let's create ourselves a new function. I have it right here. I named it reset spell cast count this turn, and it's simply going to reset the mapping by calling a set members on the spell state, and I'm feeding it an empty mapping. So we're simply going to reset completely the spell cast count this turn variable, and then once that's done, we're just going to call the callback to notify the rest of the game that we just did that. And then we're gonna do the exact same thing. So let's create another function, reset spells cooldown, and we're gonna do the same thing. So we just have to feed an empty map inside the spells cooldown to reset it, and then we can just call the callback again. Here we go. And actually we need one other function. This one is going to be called at the beginning of each turn, and it's going to be used to reduce the current cooldown of all of our spells. So we're just going to loop through all of our spells and reduce the cooldown by 1, because every turn the cooldown gets updated. So that's what we're gonna do. So since it's a fair chunk of code, I'm just going to create a new function for it. So decrease spell cooldown right here, a new function. No need, no input. We're just going to modify the current cooldown of all of our spells. And to do that, well, we have to start by looping through all of them. So I'm just going to get all my spells that are currently in cooldown by doing a keys on the mapping right here. And then we can loop through all of them. I just set them inside a local variable because I think it's going to be a little bit more clean. So I have my local variable right here for my spell. And here what we want to do is to decrease the current cooldown of that spell. So let's start by getting the current cooldown of the spell. So let's do it right here, get spell cooldown. We can do a -1 because we want to reduce the cooldown by 1 and set it into another local variable, just because I think it's going to be more clean than connecting everything together like this. Here we go. So now we know the new cooldown of the spell, but before setting it inside the mapping, we're just going to check and make sure that the spell is still in cooldown, which means that if the new cooldown is greater than 0, it means that we still have to wait at least one turn before casting the spell, and in that case we're gonna add it inside the mapping. Otherwise we're just going to ignore it. So to add it inside a mapping, I created myself a new local variable right here, which is of type eSpell to an integer, the same thing as the mapping that is inside the structure, and then we're just going to add the spell inside it. So the cooldown map right here, I'm just going to add my spell and my new cooldown right here, which is going to give us a mapping that only contains the spell that are currently in cooldown. All the ones that the cooldown are done are not going to be in the mapping anymore, and that's exactly what we want. So good, we now have the mapping. We just have to set that back inside the structure, which we just can do right here by calling a S member on our structure, feeding it the new cooldown map. And once we're done, well, we just have to call the callback again to notify the rest of the game that the stats changed. And good, now we're done with all the new functions we needed. We needed a bunch of them actually. So yeah, we're done with that. Now we just have to go use them. And the first place we're gonna use them is inside the spells right here in the can cast spells, because we want to check before casting a spell if the spell is currently in cooldown or if the unit already casted that spell way too many times this turn. So we're gonna add those checks at the end of the function after checking everything else. And the first thing we're gonna check is if the spell is currently in cooldown. So right here, we're gonna check if the spell cooldown is smaller or equal to 0, which means that it is not in cooldown. If it doesn't have any turn to wait before casting the spell, it's mean, well, it's not on cooldown, so we can continue the flow right here. But if it has more than 0 turn to wait before casting the spell, well, that's gonna be false, and it means that we cannot cast the spell because we have to wait for it. And then after that, we're just gonna check if we already casted that spell too many times this turn. So we take our spell, we take how many times we casted it this turn, and we're gonna check to see if it is smaller than the maximum of times we can cast it this turn. Because if we already reached the maximum, well, we cast it too many times. So if that's the case, it's going to be false, and we're gonna return false right here because we can't cast the spell anymore. But if it's true, well, we don't have any other checks to do, so we can simply return that we can cast the spells because the spell is not on cooldown and we didn't cast it too many times already. And now that we know that the unit can cast the spell, it's time to go put the spell on cooldown once we casted it. So let's go inside the unit cast spell function right here. I'm gonna go all the way at the end after setting all the statistic of the unit right here. We're just going to add ourselves a little sequence because both bit of codes are going to be pretty similar. So I think it's going to be a little bit cleaner with a sequence. And then we're gonna start with the cooldown. So let's start by checking, okay, does the spell have a cooldown? So if the cooldown turn count is greater than 0, it means that the spell has a cooldown, and we have to apply it to the spell after casting it. So here it is. After casting the spell, we're just going to put it on cooldown right here. So we take the spell and then we call the set spell cooldown function. And for the cooldown, for the amount of turn we want to put the spell on cooldown, well, we are just going to take it from the structure right here, which is the structure that was set in the data table. So we are taking the amount of turn we want to put the spell on cooldown, and we are setting it on cooldown, as simple as that. And then I'm gonna go back a little bit in the back right here, and then we're gonna do the same thing, but for the amount of times we can cast the spell per turn. So here first, let's check if the spell has a limit. In my case, I've set it to 999 when we don't have a limit for that specific spell, so I'm using that same 999 number when I don't want to put a limit on my spell right here. And then if the spell has a limit, an amount of times it can be casted per turn, I'm just going to set the cast count per turn. I'm going to increase the amount of times the spell was casted this turn by simply calling the set spell cast count this turn, passing it the spell. And for the cast count, well, we can just take the amount of time the spell was casted this turn by doing a get spell cast count this turn and adding 1 to it. So we're going to increment the value by 1 because the spell was casted 1 more time. Okay, great. Now we are checking if the spells are in cooldown before casting them, and then we are putting them in cooldown after the unit casts the spell. And there's one last thing to do before being able to test that mechanic, and it is to decrease the cooldown of our spells every turn, because right now it never happens, so the spell is going to be on cooldown forever. So let's go do that. But first I'm gonna go in the combat started, because we want to reset everything at the beginning, because we want it to be clean. We want to make sure that it is clean. So I'm just going to do a reset spell cast count this turn, and also a reset spell cooldown at the beginning of the combat, just so we are sure that everything is clean. And I'm actually going to do the exact same thing in the combat ended. So at the end of the combat, I'm going to reset the spell cast count this turn and also the spell cooldown, just to make sure that it is clean at the beginning and at the end of the combat. And now we just have to reduce the cooldown at the end of every turn. So let's go in turn ended. If the unit is still alive, we don't want to reduce the cooldown. If the unit is dead, it doesn't matter in that case. But if the unit is still alive, I'm going to first start by resetting the spell cast count this turn, because we want the variable to be completely clean at the beginning of next turn, because that variable is specifically used for the current turn. And then we want to reduce the spell's cooldown at the end, so decrease spell cooldown afterwards. We don't want to completely reset the spell cooldown in that case, because if the spell is in cooldown for 3 turns, we really want it to be in cooldown for 3 turns, so we're just going to reduce it by 1 every turn until the spell is not on cooldown anymore. And that's it, we're done with the mechanic. But actually, before going to test, I'm just going to delete all those print string because I'm really tired of them. They are not useful anymore, so I'm gonna go in my combat started, delete the print string that I have right here. The turn started, same thing, delete the print string, and then turn ended, we just deleted it. And then in combat ended, I'm gonna do the same thing, delete the print string. Perfect, now we can compile, save, and go see how it looks in the game. So here I have 3 units that I know that have either a limit of how many times they can cast a spell per turn or a cooldown on some of those spells. So first I'm gonna start with the priest right here. I know that my dark wave has a 3-turn cooldown. So let's cast it. Okay, I cannot cast it another time because first I don't have enough action point, but also it's supposed to be on cooldown. So we'll see next turn if it works. Then I'm gonna go to my chicken right here. I have my run chicken run spell that has 2 turns cooldown, so we can cast it once. Okay, this one seems to work a little bit better because I still have enough action point to cast it, but I cannot cast it because it's on cooldown, so it seems to work. Okay, we'll see next turn. Then I'm gonna end my turn and go to my warrior. This one, the sword slash, I know that I can only cast it once per turn, so let's cast it once. Okay, I cannot cast it anymore, even though I still have enough action point to do it, so I cannot do it, but we'll see next turn if the spell is reset properly. Good. Let's go back to the priest. My spell is still on cooldown because it's a 3-turn cooldown. It's a pretty long cooldown, so I cannot cast it again. Okay, next, go to the chicken. I cannot cast the run chicken run because it has a 2-turn cooldown. We still have to wait one more turn. Then I'm gonna go back to my warrior. This one, okay, I can cast my spell again because it was not on cooldown. It was just a maximum amount of times that I can cast it per turn. So it seems to work. Let's go back to the priest. Okay, my priest, I cannot cast the spell. It should still be on cooldown for 1 turn. So let's wait the next turn. For the chicken, okay, this one I can cast my spell again because the cooldown is over, so I can cast it. Let's go back to the warrior. The war still works, that's not an issue. And then we go back to the priest, and now I can cast my spell another time because it's been 3 turns. Great. The mechanic seems to work, but we don't have any feedback that it works. It's just not available anymore. So what we're gonna do is just add a few changes to the buttons so we can have a bit of feedback and know which spell we can cast and how many turns we have to wait before being able to cast it again. So let's stop and go modify the button. It's in the combat spell widgets and open the button spell. And here I'm just going to go select one spell just so it's easier to see. And what I want to do is to add a number on top of my image. So I'm just going to right click on the image right here and do a wrap with overlay to have 2 components on top of each other. And then I'm going to add the text component inside it. So this is just a basic text component that I've changed a few settings right here on the right to have a shadow around my number. And I have a default number right here, but the default number, we're going to change it in the code. So it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to delete it right now. It's going to be empty by default, and then we're going to add the cooldown or the amount of times we can cast it per turn on top of it. So here we go. Since we want to modify it in the code, we just want to name it properly and also check the is variable right here. And then we can go in the graph to create the event we're going to use to modify it. And here I'm gonna go at the bottom and create myself a new custom event. So new custom event, which I named event underscore set cooldown text, and I'm feeding it the text as input. So which text we want to write on the text component, then we can just feed that text to the text component. So take the text component we added to the widget, do a set text on it, feed it the text. And on top of that, what I'm gonna do is just that if the text is empty, so if it's equal to nothing, I'm going to set the visibility of my text component to hidden. That way it's just going to be hidden when there's nothing inside it, so Unreal is not going to render it. Perfect. Now we can compile, save. The button is completed. Now we just have to go call this function inside the spell bar when we are spawning or updating the buttons inside it depending on the stats of the units. So let's go back right here. I'm gonna open the button list underscore spells, and then we're gonna go in the graph, and here we should have a function, yes, the unlinked unit stats change, which is called every time the stats of the unit changes. And inside that function, if we go at the end right here, this is where we check if we can cast a spell, and based on that result we are deciding if we want to enable or disable the button. We're gonna add a bunch of things at the end right here, but first I want to clean a few things right here. So I'm just going to give myself a bit of room and promote the spell into a local variable just so it's a little bit cleaner. So spell right here, I can reconnect it the same way it was before because we don't want to change the logic, we just want to replace it by local variable, just like that. And then I'm gonna do the same thing for the button. So promote to local variable, which I'm gonna name a button. We can connect it right here at the beginning, and I'm gonna use that same variable to reconnect my target right here. So I'm gonna take my button, drop it right here, and reconnect my target like so. We didn't change anything in the logic, we just made it a little bit more clean because we want to add some stuff at the end. So let's go there, and we're gonna add some text on the button. So first, let's check if the spell is currently in cooldown. So if the spell cooldown is greater than 0, it means that the spell is currently in cooldown, and in that case I just want to write the amount of turn we want to wait before being able to cast the spell again. So on my button I'm just going to call the set cooldown text, and I'm going to feed it the amount of turn we have to wait, which is the cooldown of the spell. That's simple, that's easy. We now have the spell cooldown written on it. That's good. But if the spell is not in cooldown, I think it will be also nice if we write the amount of times we can cast the spell during the turn in the case that we casted the spell. So let's say we casted a spell once and we have a limit of 3 times per turn. We want to know how many times we casted the spell and how many times left. So that's what we're gonna do. We're just going to write on the button some text. So on the button, write the text. This time I'm gonna do an append because I want to know how many times I casted my spell this turn versus the maximum amount of time I can cast it. So that's why I'm using an append right here. So I'm gonna write my first number before the slash, do a slash, and then I'm going to add the maximum amount of time I can cast my spell, which is going to come from the spell data. So we can break the structure right here to have access to the max cast per turn. So that's good. Now we have way more feedback and we know how many times we can cast our spells every turn. There's just one last little thing to do, and it is to reset the text in the case that the spell is not in cooldown and doesn't have a limit of casting. So let's just reset the text right here and we're done. So let's compile, save, and let's go see in game. We should have way more feedback this time. Here we go. So now I have my 4 units on my grid and we're gonna test the spells. We're gonna start with the warrior right here. I'm gonna start with the first spell. Here we go. The spell is now on cooldown for 1 turn, so I cannot cast it anymore. Okay, that seemed to work. I'm gonna go to my ranger. Now I'm gonna cast the long range arrow. I had to change the numbers in the data table because I messed them up, and the limit doesn't make sense if we put the limit on the short range arrow because we don't have enough action point to cast it multiple times. So I just moved the 2 times limit on the long range arrow, and that's why right here I'm going to cast the long range arrow and see that, yeah, I cast it once and then I have a limit of twice, so I can cast it another time before it becomes disabled like that. So now I cannot cast it a third time because I reached my limit. Okay, good. Let's go to the priest now. Let's cast the dark wave, and we can see now that we have to wait 3 turns before being able to cast it again. Okay, and my turn, I'm gonna go to my chicken. I can cast it. Okay, I have to wait 2 turns before casting it again. That's good. Go back to the warrior. Now I should be able to cast it one more time. Yes, it works, and the spell is now on cooldown for 1 turn until the next turn. Then I'm going back to the ranger. I should be able to cast my arrow twice, the same way I did before. It seems to work. That's good. And my turn, I still have 2 turns to wait for the dark wave, so I'm gonna wait. My chicken, I still have 1 turn to wait, so I'm gonna wait also. I'm gonna skip the warrior and the ranger because they don't matter. I still have 1 turn to wait for the priest, and now for the chicken I can cast my spell again. So yeah, it seems to work. And now if I go back to my priest, we can see that we are now able to cast my spell, and if I do it, well, I still have 3 turns to wait before the next time. Good, so I guess that's gonna be it for today's video, and I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye bye!